مهندس صلاح، سؤال بس، هل يلزم كتابة الاسم الثلاثي أو الرباعي في الزوم، ولا يكتفى بما هو مسجل؟ لأني أشوف بعضهم كاتب أبو محمد، بعضهم أسماء فقط بدون ما يكون الاسم الصريح الصحيح.
اللي مسجل على الموقع يا دكتور.
إيه، إذا مرة ثانية، يعني قبل أن نبدأ، نحن لسه ما بدأنا ولا شيء، لكن نذكر الاسم الذي في الزوم يجب أن يكون مطابق للاسم المسجل به حتى تكون الشهادة مطبوعة بنفس الاسم. أكرر مرة أخرى، تآمل تعديل الاسم وفق ما هو مسجل به في التسجيل.
دكتور معلش، النقطة المهمة إنه البعض يسجل على الموقع بإيميل ويدخل على الزوم بإيميل آخر، فما تنحسب له الدقائق هذه، يقعوا فيها الكل. يقول أنا
ممتاز.
حضرت اللقاء كاملا وهو داخل بإيميل آخر.
ممتاز. ممتاز. طيب، هذه تنبيهات مهمة جدا جدا. طيب، براد، هل أنت جاهز براد؟
Yes.
طيب. طيب، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا محمد بن عبد الله، عليه أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم. ثم أما بعد، آه، بداية، قبل أن يعني أبدأ بالحديث حول اللقاء وأهميته وأهمية الضيف معنا، أذكر أنه في هذا اللقاء يتوفر معنا مترجم اللغة، وهو سعادة أخي الأستاذ محمد الدقس. وللاستفادة من الترجمة، سواء من يحضر معنا باللغة الإنجليزية يستطيع الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة أو interpretation واختيار اللغة المناسبة له. إذا تحدثت أنا كعربي باللغة العربية تظهر باللغة الإنجليزية، وإذا تحدث المتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية ستظهر باللغة العربية. هذا واحد. اثنين، أيضا يتوفر لدينا لغة الإشارة، وسعادة أخو الأستاذ سعود العصيمي مشكورا لفئة غالية علينا. وهذه يعني الخدمة هي بتوجيه معالي المدير العام بالاهتمام بهذه الفئة. للتوضيح فقط أكرر مرة أخرى، تعديل الأسماء وفق ما هو مسجل به، الدخول بنفس الإيميل المسجل به حتى تحسب الشهادات، تحسب يعني الوقت الذي استفاد منه المستفيد معنا. طيب، اسمحوا لي بداية أن أرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب، نيابة عن معالي الدكتور عبد الرحمن بن محمد العاصمي، المدير العام لمكتب التربية العربي لدول الخليج. كما أنقل لكم تحيات زملائي وزميلاتي الأفاضل الذين يعملون خلف الشاشات، وأيضا يعملون في المكتب والمراكز المتخصصة له في خدمة التربية والتعليم في دولنا الأعضاء بالمكتب. وأيضا كذلك اسمحوا لي أن أرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب في هذا اللقاء الذي يعد من اللقاءات المهمة جدا، والتي نستفتح به لقاءات برنامج العودة للمدارس. ولا شك أن العودة للمدارس لها العديد من البروتوكولات التي تعمل في ضوئها الدول الأعضاء، سواء من الاستعداد بالبيئة المدرسية، أو الاستعداد أيضا كذلك بالمناهج والمقررات الدراسية، أو بالاستعداد أيضا بالمعلمين والمعلمات. ونحن نرفع لهم القبعة ونحييهم من هذا المكان، أو أيضا كذلك بكافة الخدمات التي تتيح للأنظمة التعليمية بداية قوية وجادة. وبتوجيهات من معالي المدير العام، عمل المكتب على إعداد حزمة من اللقاءات التربوية، 8 لقاءات تربوية في عدة مواضيع. استفتحنا بها لقاء مهم جدا من حيث الموضوع ومن حيث الشخصية التي تقدم هذا اللقاء. لقاؤنا سيكون حول المعلمين، ولا شك أن المعلمين هم حجر الأساس في العملية التعليمية، والاهتمام بهم هو ديدن وزارة التربية والتعليم. وأيضا كذلك المكتب يعمل من خلال برامجه على تقديم ما يمكن لهذه الفئة الغالية التي عليها مناط التكليف ومناط الاعتماد بعد الله عز وجل في بناء الأجيال النافعة لأنفسهم ولمجتمعاتهم وأوطانهم. لقاء هذا اليوم سيكون حول الأولوية للمعلمين. هذا العنوان يتكامل مع كثير من المواضيع والمقالات والمجالات التي غطاها المكتب. المكتب لديه الكثير من الإنتاج العلمي في هذا المجال. لن أتحدث عن أهمية اللقاء، لكنني اسمحوا لي سأتحدث عن أهمية الشخصية التي استضفناها في هذا اللقاء بحجم الدكتور براد جونسون، وهو خبير دولي في مجال التربية وفي مجال تخصصه في مجال ما يكتب عن التمكين المهني للمعلمين والاهتمام ببيئات المعلم وكل ما يسهم في تطوير المعلم ذاتيا والاستفادة واستثمار ما لديه من إمكانات كبيرة يقدمها في قطاع التربية والتعليم. اسمحوا لي أن أقدم تعريف بسيط عن ضيفنا الدكتور براد جونسون، وسأقدمه باللغة الإنجليزية. وأيضا أعيد مرة أخرى وأذكر أنه من يريد الترجمة باللغة العربية يضغط على أيقونة الترجمة، أو الإنجليزي أيضا يضغط على أيقونة الترجمة. دكتور براد جونسون is one of the most inspiring and inspirational speakers in the field of education and leadership. He has over 30 years experience as a teacher and administration. He is dedicated to transforming the way teachers and administrators approach their roles in schools. As a servant leader, he places a strong emphasis on collaboration and empowering others to maximize their potential. Dr. Johnson is the author of 15 books on education, including Putting Teachers First, Find Your Leadership Edge, and the bestseller Be Teacher. He is ranked 7th in Global Guru Top 30 in education. He has traveled the globe speaking and training teachers and educational leaders to be there. المكتب يفخر حقيقة بترجمة كتاب براد جونسون الأولوية للمعلمين. لن أتحدث عن الكتاب، لن أتحدث عن أهمية هذا الكتاب، لكن اسمحوا لي أن نستعرض نحن وإياكم قبل أن نعطي الحديث لبراد في فيديو قصير نعرف بالكتاب في دقيقة واحدة. ما هو الكتاب؟ ما هي فصوله؟ وكيف يمكن الحصول على الكتاب؟ تفضل مهندس. لمحة بسيطة عن الكتاب، وأيضا رابط الكتاب والباركود لمن يريد الوصول إلى الكتاب. هذا الكتاب الأولوية للمعلمين، كيف تلهم فريق العمل، وكيف تحفزهم، وكيف تتواصل معهم. وأنا أقول كيف أيضا كذلك تمكن هؤلاء المعلمين، وكيف تستفيد من كل ما لديهم من إمكانات وقدرات، وتبني الثقة فيهم لتعزيز حضورهم المهني والعلمي والتعليمي في البيئة الدراسية. هذا هو الكتاب، الوصول له. الكتاب موجود في موقع المكتب، والكتاب هذا ينضم إلى قافلة الكتب الأخرى في المكتب. المكتب لديه المكتب والمراكز عموما لديه أكثر من 1900 كتاب ومادة معرفية وأصول معرفية يمكن الوصول إليها من خلال الباركود الموجود، سواء في مجال الكتاب اليوم أو في المجالات الأخرى. أترككم الآن مع الدكتور براد، ضيفنا الخبير الدولي، باسم أكثر من 400 ضيف معنا. نرحب بك ونكرر الترحيب، ونترك المجال لك لعرض ما لديك واستعراض ما لديك في الوقت المتاح لك خلال الساعة القادمة. تفضل مشكورا براد.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I love the intro. I appreciate you all taking the time to just visit with us today and share a little bit about the book. I'm going to try and see if I can pull up the PowerPoint. And so if you can let me know if you can see it. Are y'all able to see the PowerPoint?
نعم واضح، نعم واضح. تفضل.
Yes. Okay. All right. Very good. So this book is called Putting Teachers First, and it really has been my philosophy throughout my teaching career. As they shared in the beginning, I've been in education for 30 years. I started out as a teacher. I taught life science for about 10 years and then moved into administration. And then towards the end of my career, I actually moved to the university level and taught graduate level courses for people that are moving into administration. So people that were getting their master's or their doctorate in educational leadership or educational administration. And then for the last few years, I've been writing books and literally traveling the globe, sharing with education, with my experience and expertise in education. And just the best part of it for me is just getting to meet educators from all around the world. That's like a joy to me, and like kind of my dream come true is to just be able to meet so many educators, because I try to inspire people, but I often leave inspired by all the work that you do and the love that you put into your job, into making a difference for the students that you teach. And so that's why, to me, I'm a huge advocate for teachers. I love everybody in education, administrators, staff, et cetera, but just there's something about the teachers being there in the classroom with the students every day that I just feel like we really need to make sure that we are giving them everything that they need to be successful, supporting them, but also encouraging them and appreciating them as well. And so if you're an administrator here, I hope you'll have some good takeaways from this on interacting and working with your staff. And teachers that are here, I hope you leave a little bit encouraged, and hopefully I'll share a little bit of insight that'll help you be an even better and more effective teacher. So I love this quote, and I share this everywhere I go. I put it on on social media. Hopefully some of you follow me. If you don't, feel free to. But the reality is the research is clear that it's not technology and it's not the curriculum, but what has the greatest impact on student learning in the classroom is the teacher. The teacher is the most important factor. And so when we think of that and we think of the importance of it, then we need to realize that the teacher is probably the most important part of education, because they are the one in the classroom that makes the biggest difference. And so because of that, since the classroom teacher is the most important, we need to realize the importance of morale with teachers. And so that's one of the big points that I try to make when I'm talking about putting teachers first, is making sure that they're taken care of, that they're supported, encouraged, and that their morale is high. Because if you read this first sentence here, to me, this is the most important thing. And if educational leaders take away one thing from this, just remember that the teacher's working environment is the student's learning environment. And let me say that again because it's so important. The teacher's working environment is the student's learning environment. So the environment that that student learns in is greatly influenced by the teacher. Are they having a good day, a bad day? Are they encouraged? Do they have high morale? Do they have low morale? All of those things can impact the student learning. And so that's why it's so critical that we talk about and put focus on teacher satisfaction. Now, when teachers are highly satisfied, we know that they create a great optimal learning environment for the students. We know that there is improved student outcome. We also see higher teacher retention. I don't know how it is globally, but here in the US, we have a high turnover or a high attrition rate of teachers. In fact, the research says that about every 5 years, we lose about half of our teachers. About 10% per year leave the field. And part of that is because they don't feel like they're supported, they're appreciated by their administrators. In fact, we spend over $8 billion a year on teacher turnover and teacher attrition. So imagine if those teachers were staying in their roles, we could use that money for a lot of other things like giving them raises, giving them better resources, and things like that. Positive school climate is a big part of that too, how they interact with each other, how they interact with staff, how they interact with students, how they interact with administration. If they are satisfied in their role, they will create a more positive, supportive environment as well. And then we know the teacher's mental health is a big part of that, because when teachers don't feel like they're appreciated, when they don't feel like they're supported, it can increase stress. And it's also a big part of the reason that we see teacher burnout as well. And about 70% of teachers here in the US say that they feel either highly stressed or burnout. And as I've traveled around the globe, I think that's pretty consistent. I think that teachers in every culture feel the pressure, feel the stress, and are really dealing with a lot of burnout. And so that's why it's so important for us to focus on helping them. I created this chart. I call it a teacher hierarchy of needs. And so we need to remember this when we are working with our teachers. We need to think about them having adequate resources. We need to think about them having time to plan and do their work. But we have to move above that. A lot of times we focus on just that bottom level, but teachers need to feel an emotional connection to their colleagues, to their administrators. They need to feel valued and respected in their job, and of course, appreciated and affirmed. If we can get to that level, then we can move them up to the level where they maximize their potential. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about maximizing their strengths, which I'll talk a little bit about today. So a lot of this flows from the Putting Teacher First book, which we've been talking about and they've shared with you. And a little bit is extra I've put in to just kind of paint a broader picture of teacher support and teacher encouragement. So when we think of education and learning, I believe that it is relationship-centered. I believe that children learn best when they feel like a teacher cares about them, supports them, respects them. I have an example here that I show, and this is a basketball player and his coach. His name's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was one of the greatest players in the NBA. He played for Coach Wooden, who won more national championships in basketball at the college level than other coach in the U.S. And if you look at the picture on the left, you see that young Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he was about 18 years old there, I guess, 18, 19 years old. And he's with Coach Wooden. And they're, talking strategy, practice, and things like that. But the thing about Coach Wooden is he always made sure he developed strong relationships with his students and with his team, the players that he taught. The other picture is showing them 40 years later. And what they're doing is celebrating one of those national championships that they had won. And what I love about this picture is this is 40 years later, and you still see that they have a bond. They still have that relationship. But what's even cooler is if you look and see that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is almost holding and leading and helping him along now. And that just shows the power of relationship. It shows the power and the impact that you can have on students, that you can literally change their lives because of the relationships that you build with them, that trust, that encouragement, wanting the best for them, helping them to become their best is so critical. And so I've always thought that these two pictures kind of show that and exhibit that in a great way. Learning is really relationship centered. And you've probably heard the cliche before that students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But that is the truth. When they know you care about them, respect them, and want the best for them, they will almost always work harder for you and want to please you. And that is such a key element in education today. Again, you're going to hear me talk a lot about relationship. Data informs, but relationships transform. That's why the teacher's so important. Putting the teacher first, because the teacher's the one in the classroom that's going to make the difference in the lives of the students. See, we can look at all the data we want, but really at the end of the day, it is that teacher in the building those relationships with the student that's going to transform their life. That's going to help them become the student, the person that we want them to be. In education, it is those connections that matter most. Now, what's interesting here, and I want to share just a little bit, this is one part that isn't in the book, but it feeds back to putting teachers first. What we found in our research that I've done over the last couple of years is that teaching is what we call a high agreeableness profession. Agreeableness is a personality trait. There's something called the Big Five personality traits. There's one called openness. There's one called conscientiousness. There's one called extroversion. There's one called agreeableness. And then there's one called neuroticism. And I like to joke that when we think about neuroticisms, like kind of having a negative attitude, that a lot of times that all teachers will eventually have that because teaching is a hard job. It's a tough job. And so sometimes we'll feel that way. But what we found with agreeableness is that people that tend to be high in agreeableness tend to be people that are attracted to jobs that are high in agreeableness. And teaching is considered the most agreeableness profession. There's three that are similar. Teaching's number one, nursing is number two, and social work's number three. But so what we find is people that tend to gravitate, not all, but that in general, people that tend to gravitate towards teaching tend to be high in agreeableness. And here are some of the traits that you see on the screen: being empathetic, being kind, caring, compassionate. All of those are traits of someone with high agreeableness. Now, what's interesting, if you think about it, those are great traits for teachers to have. We want teachers to be kind, caring, empathetic. So that's one of the reasons they're drawn to the profession, because education really needs that. That's how we reach the students. But when people are high in agreeableness, there are some disadvantages to that. Remember, this is a personality trait, so it's not like you really choose your personality, but these tend to be the traits that you reflect. And so while you may be kind, caring, empathetic, and if you think about it and reflect, those of you that are listening, we have almost 500 people on the Zoom call right now. You probably, many of you are nodding and shaking your head in agreement that you do have many of those traits. And that's a great thing. And again, that's part of why you got into teaching. But there are some disadvantages. And as you look through this list, you'll probably shake your head in agreement that you have these as well. Because people that are high in agreeableness tend to not be very good at standing up for themselves. You know, you'll fight hard for your students, for your colleagues, but you hardly ever stand up for yourself. You usually put yourself last. You're always thinking of others. High agreeable people are very other focused, which again is a great thing, but there is this disadvantage that comes with it. People that are high in agreeableness tend to hate conflict. How many of you, and you can raise your hand at home or tap it on the screen there, but how many of you don't like conflict? You try to avoid it. That is a disadvantage, because the thing is, conflict isn't necessarily bad if it's handled correctly. How many of you are your own worst critic? I say this about teachers all the time, and I share with administrators and leaders. I'm like, you'll probably never say something to a teacher that they haven't said to themselves or beaten themselves up over 100 times, because teachers are so highly conscientious that they are their own worst critic. They feel like they have to be perfect, which is another one right down there. How many have trouble setting boundaries or saying no? That's another disadvantage. That's part of the reason that we see teachers burn out. Because when you have trouble setting boundaries, you may work 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. You may work on the weekends and holidays. You have trouble setting those boundaries where that you are taking time for yourself. And that falls right in with the difficulty saying no, is you feel like you have to say yes to everything. And occasionally, if you build up the courage to say no to something being added, you feel guilty about it. And again, if I was to ask you, most of you would probably raise your hand in agreement. But that's part of how that we have so many teachers that are burning out, because we don't have the ability to say no. We have trouble setting boundaries. So we keep letting people add more and more to our plate until we just can't take it anymore. So what do we do with that? How do we deal with that, the disadvantages? Well, there's something called being assertive. Being assertive is a skill set that is so important for people that are high in agreeableness. Now, when we hear the word assertive, people that are high agreeable tend to think of it as a bad word, like it's a negative thing, kind of like conflict. We just automatically see it as bad. But being assertive is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And like I said, assertiveness is a skill set. It's something that we develop. It's something you have to work on. It's not something that comes naturally. So when you're a high agreeable person and you want to be more assertive, what you have to do is learn how to express your needs, to share your opinions without being scared. You have to learn how to set those boundaries in your life. You know, I'm only going to work till this time. I'm going to take these nights off. You have to learn how to be assertive in setting those boundaries. And then part of that too, though, when we talk about assertiveness, is doing all that, setting those boundaries, being more confident with yourself. But it's also why being respectful of other people too. Because if you don't want to do something, how you handle it, how you say it is important as well, because you don't want to seem like that you're aggressive. And that's the word we often think of when we hear assertive, but aggressive isn't assertive. Assertive is having those traits, but also being respectful of others as well. And it's something you have to work on. It's a skill set that you have to build. Because again, the first time you say no, the first time you set those boundaries, you're probably going to feel guilty. You're probably going to feel bad. You may even change your mind. But work on it, develop them, become confident in those things. So when we think about becoming assertive, we have to focus on ourselves a little more. Remember, I talked about highly agreeable people are always other focused. So you have to think about yourself sometimes, your health, your mental health, taking time, setting aside time for your family, how to handle conflict, establishing those boundaries that we talked about, evaluating what you want and need. Because see, you're always so other focused. Sometimes you don't even realize what you really want or what you need. I have administrators sometimes that tell me they get frustrated with teachers because they know that they have an issue, but they really don't know how to tell them. And that's why, though, because we very rarely focus on ourselves when we are highly agreeable. And then the last one that's so important is to focus on your strengths, to focus on your talents and your abilities. And that's the thing I want to talk about for just a minute. That's going to help you in your role. It's going to help the administrators help put you first and help you to be most effective. Because see, the reality is those strengths and talents that we have, most of us don't even know what they are because we don't value what we do well in society. If you think about it in culture and society at large, we're always told that if something is of value, that it takes hard work. You have to work hard to get something. But the reality is our strengths and our talents are something that come easy to us. That's why there are strengths and our talents. There's something we do well without requiring a lot of work. In fact, the word talent actually means worth or value. And we all have them. You all have talents and strengths. They're the talents and strengths you bring to the job, you bring to the classroom, you bring to your administrative role, you bring to your staff. They're the things that you do well that you bring to make everybody else better. And so when we think about that, I often ask teachers, if I was to ask you to stand up and share what are some of your strengths, what are some of your talents, most of you would probably struggle to tell me just one. And it may be a struggle, and some of you may not even be able to think of one. When I finished teaching and I went to the university level, the first thing I would have my students do, because they were moving into leadership roles, is I would have them take something called a Strength Finders test. And the Strength Finders test gives it lays out your top 3 to 5 leadership strengths or talents that you have. And we all have them. What was interesting, though, is I would have them write a paper reflecting on what their strengths were. And do you know that probably 95% of them, the first thing they would write in that paper is that they had never really thought that they even had leadership strengths? And that's why, in fact, Gallup does a lot of studies and pollings with hundreds of thousands of people over time. What we found is about 80% of people don't really recognize or fully understand what their strengths and their talents are. 80% of adults. If I was to ask you to stand up and tell us, you may struggle to tell us one or two. You know what else is interesting, though? If I was to ask you to stand up and tell me the talents or strengths of your colleague, of someone on your team, you could probably tell me 3 or 4 without even thinking about it. Isn't it interesting that we can see the greatness in others that we don't even see in ourselves? That's why it's so important to be self-reflective, to think about what you're good at, to think about what you bring to the table. See, that's why the teachers, the highly effective teachers, are so successful in the classroom, because they're bringing strengths and their talents to the classroom to meet the needs of their students. And that's what is amazing about teachers. What is your strengths? Also, for administrators that are out there, think about this. We hire teachers for their strengths. You know, if you want a science teacher and you're interviewing them for a job, you're looking at what strengths they bring to the job. And we hire people for those strengths that they bring. But then guess what we do immediately? We begin to manage them based on their weaknesses. My very first job I went into, I remember I was hired for the job. I was all excited. The first thing my administrator did after I was hired and started with the pre-planning, she brought me something called a PAC. It's a professional appraisal cycle. And the goal was for me to pick 3 or 4 areas that I felt I was weak in. Again, managing weaknesses. But I was to spend the whole year focused on trying to improve those weaknesses. And I had to do things and show work in that appraisal cycle. I had to, show ways that I had improved those weaknesses and share that at the end of the year. Can you imagine how defeated I felt when the first thing after I'm hired for a job is to say, hey, let's focus on your areas of weakness for the whole year. But that's what we do. Think about it. We do it with students as well. If we have a student that does great in math and poor in reading or writing, what do we focus on? We focus on those areas that they don't do well. We hardly ever really focus on what they do great. The interesting thing is the research again shows that when we look at people's success in life, when we focus on just making our weaknesses better, improving our weaknesses, we only are minutely more successful, just a little bit. But when we focus on our strengths and developing them and maximizing them, then we are exponentially more successful. But in our cultures, that's what we focus on, our weaknesses. We got to work on our weaknesses. That doesn't mean you ignore them. That doesn't mean you never focus on them. But that does mean that you're never going to reach full potential if that's all we focus on. When we bring in those teachers with certain strengths, we need to develop them and let them maximize those so that they can be the very best that they can be. And that's an important way that we put teachers first, is by developing their strengths and their talents. Because when they realize they have strengths and talents and we're helping develop them, guess what they're going to be? They're going to be more successful. They're going to be confident. And they're going to be willing to try new things, harder things, and be an even better teacher. So when we put teachers first, part of that is developing their strengths and their talents to be the best that they can be. Because that's what we want in the classroom. We want teachers that are successful and that can bring their very best. I did a study. I think 1 million people, I don't remember the number, there was about 150,000 teachers included in this. And what they found is that when, let's talk about teachers here, it can be administrators too, but when you don't feel like you're valued in your role and that your strengths are being utilized in your role, or let me change that, when you feel like that your strengths are being utilized in your role and that you feel valued as an employee, you are 6 times more engaged in your work. That is a mind-blowing number. When people feel like they're valued and that they are using their strengths and talents, you're 6 times more engaged. If you have a teacher that's 6 times more engaged, can you imagine what that classroom will look like? Can you imagine the passion they bring, the inspiration they bring, the difference that they'll make to the students, simply because they feel valued in their role? And it doesn't just affect their teaching, but people that feel like they are valued and their strengths are being used in their role are 3 times more likely to say they have an excellent quality of life. Isn't that a powerful thing? Not only to think your job's better, but to feel like you have an excellent quality of life. Because here's the reality. We always talk about work-life balance, but there's really only life. If you have a bad day at school, guess what's probably going to happen? You're probably going to go home and have a bad night. Because that bad day at school goes home with you, unfortunately. But if you have a good day at school, you feel valued, you have a great day, you're probably going to have a great night. And so when that happens, no wonder these people feel like they have a higher quality of life. You're also less likely to quit your job. The research is pretty clear, and I'll share a little bit more in a minute, but the research is clear. When people have a good relationship with their leaders, with their administrators, with their managers, they want to stay in those jobs. When I see schools here that have high turnover, lots of teachers leaving, the first thing I ask is, what kind of culture is that principal, that school leader creating? And you know, the research sadly says that 7 out of 10 employees, and this includes teachers, that 7 out of 10 do not feel like they're valued in their role. Being valued doesn't really take more money or anything. You know, it's pretty simple to do. Show them you care, support them, encourage them, show them appreciation. Those are powerful things that we often overlook, especially if we are in leadership roles. Sometimes we get so busy and we're so focused on other things, or we're focused on policies and procedures. Sometimes we forget the people. But I always like to say, at the end of the day, when school's over and we turn off the lights and we go home, we're not teachers and staff and administrators then, we're just people. And so make sure that you're taking care of your people, that they're appreciated and encouraged and valued. More research on this when we think of putting teachers first, and this is in the book. Only about a quarter, 26%, only about a fourth of employers show regular recognition and appreciation for their employees. And that aligns with that where 7 out of 10 in the other research don't feel like that they're valued. So the research is pretty consistent that we are greatly lacking in valuing the people that we lead. Of the employees that felt like their morale was high, 94% believed that their managers, that their leaders, that their principals were effective at giving them recognition and praise and appreciation. Again, it costs nothing but time and building those relationships with them. And look at that number. Almost 80% of employees who quit their jobs say that a major reason is because of lack of appreciation from their leaders. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes I think we forget in education and we're trying to be professional and we're looking at the data and we're trying to do the curriculum, sometimes we forget to just be people and remember the importance of those relationships with people. Because remember, like I said at the very beginning, and if there's one thing I hope you take away from this, is that learning, education, even leadership itself is relationship centered. Everything revolves around the relationship. So when we look at that and we look at staff and we focus on these things, there's 3 expectations that I feel like every school needs to have. Number 1 is whatever your role, be world class. I know we mainly just have teachers and administrators on here, but everyone in the school, the custodians, the front office, cafeteria workers, when we create a culture where everyone is giving their best and doing their best, man, you can create a culture of excellence. So that first is so important. Whatever your role, be your best and do your best. And again, if we're valuing them, if we as leaders are showing them appreciation and support and encouragement, it makes it so much easier for them to give their best. Because think about it, when I know a leader appreciates me and values what I do, I'm going to give them my best. And then number 2, no surprises. This one kind of comes back to the conflict I was talking about. Because conflict can cause a lot of problems in school. Just one negative person can cause a lot of trouble in a school. So my thing with this, kind of like with conflict, is if you have an issue with someone, go to that person and talk to them. You know, as a leader, when I was an administrator, I didn't want to hear through the grapevine that someone had an issue. I wanted them to be able to come and tell me personally. And I hope that I did that with everyone as well. When I had an issue with someone, that I went to them personally. Because here's the thing, if someone has an issue with you and they haven't come to you and talk about it yet, do you know what they're doing? They're talking to someone else about it. Now, they may go home and talk about it with their family, their spouse, or someone. If it's school, they're probably talking to a teammate or something. But when we have issue with someone, if we're not talking to that person, we're probably talking to someone. And that's how the grapevine grows and builds and causes all kinds of negativity in the school. Now, remember, teachers tend to be high agreeable, so we are uncomfortable with that type of going to someone and talking to them face to face. But that's something we have to learn to do. Because when we can just go to that person and work it out and talk it through without things being spread around, it creates such a better working environment. In fact, when 2 people have an issue, ideally, nobody else should even know. It should be them coming together and working it out. And so that, as an administrator, I always told my staff, if you have an issue with me, I better not hear it from somebody else. I want to hear it from you. And then we will work it out. We will talk it through. Because the thing is, like I asked earlier, and most of you probably agreed, we don't like conflict. Because we don't like it, we're not very good at it. And so we don't like to do it. So usually we put it off until we are like emotionally charged about it. We pick the very worst time to engage in conflict. When if we will realize that it's an important part of the process, we'll be like, you know, I know it's not comfortable, but I need to go to this person and talk to them. And so many things can be resolved without it spreading or without it causing more problems. And then number 3, we support and celebrate each other. I think it's so important for teachers and administrators and schools to realize we're not in competition with each other. You know, go in some schools and they like for attention from staff, they'll sometimes, you know, they'll be in competition over who has the best room, who has the best decorations, who does the most. But we should be working together. We should be cooperating instead of being competitive. And we should be supporting and celebrating each other. You ever thought about it? When students from about the age of 5 or 6 to about age 18 spend most of their waking hours in school, shouldn't that be a place they want to come? And as adults, as teachers, and even administrators, most of our waking day is spent at school. And so if most of our waking hours is spent at school, shouldn't that be a place we want to go to? Shouldn't that be a place we look forward to going to? That's why I say we don't do a good enough job of supporting each other, of celebrating each other, of appreciating each other. Because when I talk about putting teachers first and supporting and appreciating them, it's not just the principal's role. It's not just the school leader's role, but it's our role as educators, as teammates, to encourage each other, to show each other appreciation. So let's celebrate successes. Let's celebrate what each other's doing. We do it with our students, right? A student finally figures something out or does something, we celebrate. But let's do that with each other too. Let's encourage each other and build each other up. If we'll do those 3 things, we will begin to build a culture of excellence in our schools. Now, for administrators, this one is so important, because to put teachers first, part of that is they have to trust you and believe in you. And so I call this building trust capital. Teachers, this is also important for you to do with students. You want your students to trust you before you can really build those strong relationships with them. So building trust capital is so important. So think about this for a minute. When I talk about building trust capital, what I'm saying is, as a leader especially, ask for input from your staff. Get feedback from them. Ask them for input on decisions that are being made. Because what that does is that shows them that you value them as a professional, that you value their expertise, and that you value their experience. Because I don't know how it is outside the US specifically, but in the US, we have a high turnover rate of our school leaders. Our principals only stay in a school, the average is about 3 to 4 years. Some obviously stay longer, but that means some schools have a new principal every year or every 2 years. So it's important with that high turnover for them to build that trust with the staff. And so when I talk about that, getting the input, listening to them, believing in them, and when I talk about that turnover rate too, you know, there's probably some teachers that have been in education longer than the school leaders, probably know more than the school leaders. And sometimes we forget that we have all this valuable experience and expertise within the school walls. But when you'll take the time to ask them and input and take things that they say and use them at times and let them know when you don't, why you didn't, that's how trust capital. And then over time, what happens when you deposit that, listening to them, getting feedback from them, getting input from them, you're depositing that into an account. And that's that trust capital that you're building. And so what happens then, there will be times when you have to make a tough decision. There will be times when you have to make an unpopular decision. But because you built that trust with them, they will trust that you're still doing the best thing for them, even if they don't agree, even if it's not popular. When you build that trust, that allows them to say, you know what? They've always been fair. They've always listened to us. So I'm going to trust that they're doing the best thing now. And how powerful is that? So to build that trust, think about it. Be consistent, be transparent, be authentic, and then be accountable. I think a lot of times as leaders, we forget that. We're so worried about being accountable to the people above us. But true leadership is learning how to be accountable to those that you lead. So powerful. For the leaders and even for teachers, understand that EQ is most important. In fact, the research says that for people, the odds of someone being effective in a leadership role has more to do with their level of what we call emotional intelligence, even greater than their IQ, their intellectual intelligence. That EQ is a greater measurement of leadership success. So that means being self-aware. It's so important to be self-aware of how you react, how you interact, how you talk to your staff. You know, I've had teachers share with me that they'll see an administrator walking down the hall and walk by them and won't even take the time to go, won't even look them in the eye. And I'm like, I know administrators are busy. They have a lot of pressure. They're going to meetings, but never underestimate the importance of taking the time to just say good morning or hello. You know, I'm a firm believer that our leaders, our principals, our school leaders, that they lead best not from their office, not in a meeting, but when they're in the hallways, when they're in the cafeteria, when they're dropping by to visit a classroom. That's when they're doing the best leadership, because you're building those relationships. You're building those small moments. You're being aware. You're being empathetic to those you lead. Building those relationships, again, is the key. Because this, I truly believe, everyone is responsible for the culture of a school, everyone that's in it. But the principal, that school leader, because I know they're called different things and different, you know, head of school, there's different names, but that main school leader is the thermostat that regulates the environment of the school. And so when they're focused on appreciation and encouragement and those things, you see it reflected through the whole school. I'm often say that when I go into a school, I can tell within 5 minutes what kind of leadership is in that school, simply by how the front office invites me in, the conversations with adults that I see in the hallway. I can tell really quick the type of culture that a school leader has created in their school. And that's a powerful thing. That first impression tells a lot. So never underestimate, as a school leader, the importance that you have on developing that school culture. When we talk about putting teachers first, again, as leaders, have what I call aspirational conversations with them. At the end, we have a formal teacher evaluation. I don't know if y'all have those. You probably have something like it. But over here, we have a formal teacher evaluation. It's basically just going in, observing them teach a lesson and giving them feedback on it. But to me, that again takes away the person. So I encourage leaders here to have what I call aspirational conversations. And when you do that, what you're doing is asking them questions such as, how has your year been? What do you think we do well at this school? What do you think we could do better? As a leader, have you ever thought about asking your staff that? Can you imagine how valued they feel when you ask their opinion on such things? Because some of them may have great ideas. Are we utilizing your strengths? Are we getting the best out of each other? That's an important question to ask. And then, of course, when we talk about aspirational, what they want to become aspiring to, how can I help you achieve your professional goals? Because I am known telling school leaders, educational leaders, you should be a talent scout. And you may not have ever heard that term before put that way, but you should be a talent scout. You should be looking for the talents and strengths that are within your staff and find ways to help build them up to be the best that they can be. Some may want to move into administration. Some may want to move into a leadership role as a teacher. Some may want to move into curriculum or whatever. You should be a talent scout. You should see what's going on with them and finding ways to help them be their best. Because when you're putting people in roles they want to be in and where their strengths are suited, man, you're going to build a dynamic school of excellence. And again, it goes back to showing them that you value them and what they bring. So let's celebrate. Let's celebrate each other. Let's celebrate the students. I tell administrators, I call it Post-its of praise. You know, the little Post-it notes that you get and they come, they're sticky and you can peel them off. As an administrator, I would take them around, and when I would go into a classroom to observe informally, I would leave the teacher a note. Great job with class today. Your students are lucky to have you. Just something simple, something about the lesson that I like. Post-its of praise. What those teachers do, they hold on to them like treasures. When I post something like this on social media, I can't tell you the number of teachers that will message me or post online in the comments. They're like, I have every one of them that's ever been given to me. Because we need to remember teachers are affirmational. That's part of being high agreeable. So as leaders, we need to make sure that we are affirming them of the work that they do. Everyone likes to be recognized for a job well done. I don't care who the person is or what the job they're doing. We just, as human beings, want to be recognized for the job that we do. And so something as simple as a Post-it of praise makes a big difference. And again, it doesn't need to just be the administrators doing it. Teachers can do that with each other. When we talk about putting teachers first, do that with each other. Say, hey, I saw you doing this, or man, your class is so lucky to have you. Encourage each other. It's not just the administrator's job, but all teachers should be encouraging each other, building each other up, because you are a team. And we want that team unity. Again, we spend so much time together. So much of our waking hours are there together. Let's make it a place we want to be. Let's make it a place where we encourage each other and build each other up. And think about appreciation. When people are appreciated, the research we saw before, and I just want to reiterate it here, they're more engaged and productive, more likely to stay with the school, more likely to receive high satisfaction from students and parents. You may not have ever heard before, but there is research that's done that says for every one criticism, you need to have 5 compliments or praises. So you know what that means? That means whether we're leaders or teachers or whatever our role, we should be positive and complimentary and praising 5 times more often than we are being critical. That means it should become a mindset. It should become a habit that we're focusing on the good that people do. 5 praises for 1 criticism. That sounds like a big ratio, but that is what the research says. Because think about it, if I tell you one good thing and one bad thing, what are you going to think about the rest of the day? You're going to think about that one bad thing, that one criticism. A student makes an A and an F, which one do they think about the rest of the day? That F. Negative affects us so greatly that we have to make sure that we're giving enough praise, appreciation, support, and encouragement. That's how we create a great culture. Add to the calm, not the chaos. This is so important for administrators. It's so important for teachers too. Because sometimes we have students that come to school with a lot of trauma and a lot of issues, and we want the classroom to be a place where they feel like that they belong and that it almost feels like family. So I always say add to the calm, not the chaos. But especially for leaders, that's so important. When you think of the last few years and everything from COVID and everything in between, there's always chaos. And so make sure that you are that pillar of calmness, of strength for your staff. So important. And then I have two quotes here that I've written over time. This one says, love what you teach, but love who you teach more. And sometimes teachers will tell me, they'll be like, oh, great, now I have to love my students too. And my thing is, you may not always like them, but you should always love them. And when I say the word love, I mean that you respect them, that you care for them, that you want the best for them. Because sometimes you're not going to like them. Sometimes they're probably going to get on your nerves. But I've been around long enough. I had students that got on my nerves that I met when they were older as adults. And you know what? They turned out to be pretty good people. Because I think sometimes we forget as teachers that the students are just kids trying to figure out who they are and figure out life. Whether they're in first grade or 12th grade, they're just trying to figure out where they fit in. So to love them means to care for them, to want the best for them, and to help them be their best. And then you may have seen this quote. I wrote this during COVID. This is probably the most quoted quote in the last 4 years. And I just wrote it, I think, the day everything shut down here in the US, but it's just relationships before rigor, grace before grades, patience before programs, and love before lessons. The reason I wrote it is because it goes back to what I said at the very beginning, that education is really about relationship. When it's at its best, doing its best, and being most effective, it's because of relationships. Because in relationships, we learn something. We learn how to give grace. We learn how to be patient. We learn how to love, like I talked about a minute ago. But I also think it's important for teachers, especially, to remember that when we talk about grace and patience, that you need to give them to yourself as well. Remember, I talked about teachers are so hard on themselves. They're so critical of themselves sometimes. Sometimes you're so good at giving grace and patience to others, but you have to learn how to give it to yourself as well. That doesn't mean rigor's not important. That doesn't mean grades are not important. But again, this goes back to the humanity of education. We are people first. Whether it's the school leader, district leader, whether it's the staff, the teacher, the student, people first. And when we get that part right, when we realize it's about the relationships and caring for each other and being patient with each other, when we can teach that way and live that way, we'll find out that the rest of it will take care of itself. Because when we talk about rigor, again, when the student feels like you care for them, that you want the best for them, they're probably going to give you their best. And that's what that means. The last thing I want to leave you with as teachers is to remember your legacy. Teachers have a unique job. It's a hard job. It's a tough job. It's often a very unrewarding job. And I don't just mean teachers, but educators in general, whether you're a school leader, whatever your role, it's tough work. And sometimes it's very underappreciated. But don't ever forget the impact that you're making on the lives of students. People always talk about leaving a legacy, but you get to live a legacy. You get to live a legacy because you're impacting, you're putting in, you're adding to the life of every student that you teach. And so what is your legacy? Your legacy is this. Your students may not remember everything you taught them in class. They may not remember anything you taught them in class. But they will remember that you cared, that you showed them grace, that you made them feel valued, and that you encouraged them to be their best. They will remember that, and they will remember you forever. And so I hope you take that away today, to remember that your work may be hard, but it's important. That you may have the greatest impact on students' lives more than anybody else. And that years later, just like that picture I showed you in the beginning, 30 and 40 years from now, you may not be connected to those students, but I guarantee you there will be a student somewhere that will speak fondly of you and the impact that you had on their life, because you were their teacher and you gave them your best. So thank you for having me today. I hope this was encouraging. I hope it was educational. And I hope that you have, I know you're about to start your school year as well. So I hope that you have your best school year yet. So again, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And just have a great school year.
شكرا لكم دكتور براد على هذا العرض الأكثر من رائع والمتميز في محتواه العلمي وأيضا محتواه التطبيقي. ولا يستغرب من شخصكم دكتور براد، فأنتم الخبير بدءا بكونك كنت معلم إلى أن تدرجت وأصبحت عضو هيئة تدريس، فأنت مارست المهنة وأيضا كذلك كتبت عن المهنة، ولعل كتابك الأولوية للمعلمين يعبر عن شخصيتك المهنية والعلمية كذلك. أنا على المستوى الشخصي تعلمت منك الكثير، استفدت من كتابك الكثير، أيضا قرأته بحكم علاقتي بالمكتب، وأيضا كذلك في رسالة الدكتوراه وتحدثت معك في اللقاء الإعدادي لهذا اللقاء أنها كانت عن التمكين المهني للمعلمين وعن التيتشر ليدرشيب، قيادة المعلم، كيف نمكن المعلم في قيادة مهنة التعليم التي لن تقوم بدون ذلك المعلم، بدون التمكين له وبدون إعطائه كافة المميزات التي يستحقها وفق ما لدى الأنظمة التعليمية. لعلك براجو أنا لن أستطيع أن أختصر كل ما ذكرته في جملة أو جملتين، والوقت من ذهب كما يقولون. نحن نريد أن نستثمر كل ما لديك من خبرة من خلال الأسئلة التي سيطرحها الزملاء والزميلات الضيوف معنا. أكثر من 500 ضيف معنا عبر منصة الزوم، وأيضا اللقاء ينقل مباشرة على قناة اليوتيوب، وهناك أكثر أيضا من 100 حاضر معنا في لقاء اليوتيوب. بدأت بجملتك الشهيرة: ليست تقنيات التعليم هي التي تصنع الفارق في التعليم، بل هم المعلمون. أيضا ركزت على أهمية رضا المعلمين، فبيئة عمل المعلمين هي بيئة تعلم الطلاب، فالبيئة التي يتعلم فيها الطالب تتأثر ببيئة المعلم. وهذه رسالة لكل قائد، لكل مسؤول، لكل مدير مدرسة، أن يركز على بيئة المعلم، وأن يهتم ببيئة المعلم حتى تكون بيئة الطالب بيئة صحية وتتحقق فيها جودة الحياة المدرسية إذا صح التعبير. والbeing للطالب لن يتحقق ما لم يكن هناك جودة حياة للمعلم، لن تكون هناك جودة حياة للمدرسة، لن تكون هناك جودة حياة للنظام التعليمي ما لم تتحقق جودة حياة المعلمين. قلت أنت دكتور براد نريد معلمين يشعرون بالحماس، وإذا لم يكن المعلم مركز للتقدير فلن يشعر بالحماس، لن يشعر بالشغف، لن يكون هناك مخرجات تعليمية محفزة ومتحمسة. تحدثت عن التراست كابيتال، وهو لن أقول أهم ما ذكرت براد، اللي هو رأس المال الثقة، وهذا مصطلح جديد ظهر براد. أنا لن أتحدث كثيرا مثل ما وعدت يعني الزملاء، ووعدتك أنت براد، فالحديث لك، الفلور is yours. أترك المجال الآن للزملاء، لمن يريد أن يداخل معنا فليرفع يده وسنقوم باختياره. أتمنى من الزملاء الذين رفعوا أيديهم مسبقا ولا يريدون المشاركة أن يخفضوا أيديهم، ومن سيشارك معنا فسنقوم باختياره حسب ما الأسماء التي وردت إلينا. وأيضا كذلك نفتح الشات مرة أخرى، ونحن أقفلنا الشات لأنه كان في حديث يدور حول هل اسمي ظاهر، ما هو اسمي، فلكن الآن سنفتح الشات مرة أخرى، وآمل التركيز بالأسئلة مباشرة حتى نستفيد من الوقت المتاح لبراد. اسمح لي براد أن أنقل لك شكر كل من كتب في الشات عن لقائك وعن أهمية المواضيع التي ذكرتها، ويعني تحديدا أن هذا اللقاء، أحد من كتب أن هذا اللقاء يدعم المعلمين الذين هم جوهر العملية التعليمية. شكرا لك براد. أخذ مداخلة من الأخ، اعذروني في الأسماء لن نستطيع أن نقول أستاذ أو دكتور لأنها ما تظهر لي، الأخ سامي القدير، إن كان نطقت اسمه في حدود دقيقة. سامي تفضل. سامي افتح المايك إذا تريد أن تشارك معنا. الأستاذة أسماء السيد تفضلي. طيب أخوان اللي رافع يده ولا يريد المشاركة يخفض يده. أشجان الأحمدي تفضلي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الصوت واضح؟
واضح واضح، تفضلي.
شكرا لكم بداية على مثل هذه المبادرات، أقدرها جدا بحكم كوني معلمة. أنا أريد أن أؤكد على ضرورة وجود بيئة تعليمية مريحة ومليئة بكثير من العناصر التي تدعم المعلمين. البيئة التعليمية للمعلمين قبل الطلاب. نحن نتكلم عن هرم تعليمي. عندما تحقق بيئة تعليمية مريحة لأي معلم وتتوفر على الأدوات التعليمية المناسبة، أنت تخلق بالضرورة طالب مميز. شكرا دكتور براد، أنت شجعتني للقراءة في الكثير في هذا المجال بحكم عملي في مجال التعليم. نشكر لك مبادرتك هذه، نقدرها جدا، ونتمنى المزيد من مثل هذه المبادرات. بارك الله فيكم ولا أطيل. شكرا.
شكرا لك أستاذ أشجان، والمكتب حريص جدا على استضافة يعني مثل القامات العلمية مثل الدكتور براد في مجاله، وأيضا كذلك ترجمة كتابه وفكرة. شكرا لك. الأستاذة سناء عبد الغفور تفضلي. اقفل المايك يا أشجان. أستاذة سناء تفضلي. سناء طيب. طيب ننتقل للأسئلة المكتوبة وبعدين بناخذ لؤلؤ النصيان. خلونا ننتقل للأسئلة ثم أرجع لك النصيان. دكتور براد هنا سؤال يقول: أنت ذكرت أن العلاقات مهمة قبل السلطة، ممكن توضح العلاقات قبل السلطة ما المقصود فيها يا دكتور؟
Do you mean the relationships before rigor?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So rigor is kind of a relative term. We always use the word rigor as like, being dedicated to something and working hard. But part of that goes back to strengths. Like we tend to work harder and work longer and put up with more if it's something we're pretty good at, versus something we're not very good at. But also when I talked about with students working harder, that can be considered the rigor, but students will work harder it's kind of like having a child at home. A child will typically work harder for their parents or want to please them when they have a good relationship with them, when they know they care about them and support them and things like that. And so it's the same way, like in the classroom, if you have a teacher that, genuinely cares about you and wants you to do well, you're probably going to work harder for them than a teacher that you may not get along with or that you feel like doesn't really like you. So that's when I talk about relationship before rigor. It's not that rigor is not important, but building that relationship will allow them probably to do more, to work harder, to try harder for you than if you didn't have that relationship.
شكرا دكتور براد. أرجع مرة أخرى للمداخلات. الأستاذة لولو والنصيان، تفضلي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
ورحمة الله وبركاته، تفضلي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
تفضلي.
معكم المعلمة لولو من صيان، تخصص بكالوريوس تاريخ، ولله الحمد والمنة الآن 24 سنة بالتعليم. مدة 20 سنة تعليم ثانوي. طبعا طرح الدكتور براد عن فكرة محبة الطلاب، يعني ولله الحمد والمنة لمدة 20 سنة تدريس طلاب الثانوية، طالبات الثانوية. بعد 20 سنة تم انتقالي إلى الطفولة المبكرة. رسائل كثيرة تأتي من طالباتي، يعني بابتعادي عنهم، بفقدهم لي أثناء التخرج، يرسلون رسائل شكر، يتمنون حضوري، وفعلا محبة الطالب. ولله الحمد لله من دخلت التعليم واضعها أمام عيني أن الطالب مشروع لخدمة أولا دينه ثم وطنه وأمته. شكرا لإتاحة الفرصة. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
سلام، شكرا لولو. تعليقك دكتور براد حول ما ذكرته الأستاذة لولو، تفضل.
Oh, no, I love that. And I love to hear those stories when teachers share that, because it's so true. There's just something about when students come back to you or write to you later, or, just they're able to tell you what you meant to them, because a lot of times that may not happen. And so that's the other thing I encourage with teachers is just because students don't come back and tell you what you meant to them doesn't mean that you didn't, and doesn't mean that you didn't impact their life. A lot of times students, may not know what to say, or, may not think about coming back. But I guarantee you, the thing I always talk about is, if you asked any person, whether they're in education or not, who had an impact on your life, almost always they will share 1, 2, or 3 teachers that greatly impacted their life. And that's what that you do every day. Every one of you, you're impacting lives and making a difference, whether they're able to tell you or not. It's just nice when you are able to hear from them and for them to tell, the difference that you made. But because that's the thing I say all the time, is that teachers are difference makers. And that's what I mean by that, because many of you do improve the trajectory and the quality of the life of the students that you teach.
شكرا لك دكتور براد. نرجع مرة ثانية للأستاذ سامي القدير. استعجل أستاذ سامي، تفضل.
السلام عليكم.
ورحمة الله وبركاته، تفضل.
الشكر موصول للدكتور سعود ولهذا الصرح العظيم مكتب التربية العربية، وتعودنا على هذا الجهد المشكور. سؤالي بعد شكر الله سبحانه وتعالى ثم شكر الدكتور براد، حكومة المملكة العربية السعودية ممثلة في وزارة التربية والتعليم في الآونة الأخيرة وبحكم تخصصي في مجال التربية الخاصة تولي هذه الفئة اهتمام منقطع النظير، بل حتى أنه يعتبر على مصاف دول العالم من المراكز العشر المتقدمة. نصيحة الدكتور براد أو كلمة يوجهها لمعلمي التربية الخاصة، خاصة الذين يتعاملون مع طلاب صعوبات التعلم وطلاب فرط الحركة وتشتت الانتباه. أكرر شكري وأعتذر على عدم الدخول مباشرة. شكرا دكتور براد، شكرا دكتور سعود.
شكرا أستاذ سامي أو دكتور سامي، والله ما تحضر الأسماء. شكرا لك كثيرا على أيضا كذلك إشادتك بجهود المملكة العربية السعودية. ونحن في مكتب التربية العربي دول الخليج نلحظ ما تقوم به المملكة وما تقوم به الدول الأعضاء في المكتب. كل دول الخليج حقا لها إسهامات في هذه الفئة. لا نتحدث كثيرا عن ما تقوم به الدول. شكرا لك على تذكيرنا بهذه اللفتة المميزة، وأترك المجال للدكتور براد للحديث حول سؤالك. تفضل دكتور براد.
Yeah, I always love to give like a special shout out to people that work with special education students, because it takes a special person with a special heart, and it is some of the toughest work there is. But I know it's also very rewarding too, because you do have such a special population that you work with. When I think about like students with autism and different things, I'm a big proponent of movement, physical activity. I've done research in that area too, and talked about the need of students to, be able to move, to have recess, to have break, to be physically active, because of just that brain-body connection is so important. And so, a lot of times when we see students and we think of like either ADD or ADHD, I know there's different levels, and I'm not sure, what special ed types of children you teach. But when we think about like some of them that with behavior problems and stuff, what we find is that, you think about when a child sits still most of the day and doesn't move around, of course, they're going to get squirrely and wiggly and, all those things. So it's just so important to, to include physical activity, unstructured play, because what the research shows is that, when we are physically active with students, when they're physically, that it actually develops what's called the executive portion of the brain that does like regulates emotions. And so that's one thing that we have a lot of times with special ed students is their regulation of their emotions. And so the more physically active they are actually helps them to regulate those emotions. So I don't know how much you're able to do or include that, but I think that's a big part of working with students like that.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور براد. دكتور براد، سؤال أيضا ورد في الشات. ما هي أبرز ما تناولت في كتابك؟ يعني لو في دقيقة واحدة أبرز العناصر اللي تناولها كتابك أو الأولوية للمعلمين.
Oh, in the book, well, I think the teacher satisfaction is so important, because like I said, it makes so much sense, but I think we forget it, but that the teacher's working environment is the student's learning environment. And so the better we can support the teacher, the better that we can help them feel valued in their role, and give them the support they need to be effective is just so important. And I think it's important for leaderships. One of the things I talk about in the book, I call it selfless leadership, but it really is about being a servant leader. And I think when leaders realize that, and I hit on it a little bit in the slide, but the accountability, we always think about being accountable to those that us, but it's so important as an effective leader to be accountable to those you lead. And really the only way you can do that is by developing those relationships with them. I call it having small talks. When you greet them in the hallway, ask them how they're doing, how's their family doing, those little things. In fact, the research shows that when we have those small conversations, those conversations that maybe you don't think are important at all as a leader, that those actually build that level of trust. Because, let's say I'm a principal sitting with a teacher. If I'm asking them what's going on in their life, how their child's doing, or what's going on, they see that I value them, that I care about them as a person. And so it actually gives an easiness and openness to that relationship, where they can come to you if they have tough problems or an issue, or they are more open to you coming to them if you have to talk to them about an issue or a problem. So again, it all goes back to the relationship between the teacher and the student, and the relationship between the administrators and the staff, and even the relationship among the staff, to be supportive, encouraging of each other. And we don't want to leave out the parents. I mean, that is an important piece too. But I usually don't talk about that so much, because it's just, there's not much I can do from that point with parents. But it is important to try and build those relationships with parents too, so that the child feels like everybody's on the same team working for the best interest for them.
شكرا لك دكتور براد، وأنا أدعو الجميع حقيقة إلى قراءة كتابك، وهو متوفر في المكتب المترجم، وهو ترجمة مكتب التربية العربي دول الخليج. وأطلب من الزملاء وضع الرابط مرة أخرى في الشات. وأتيح المجال الآن للأستاذ ضيف الله الزهراني في دقيقة واحدة. ما هو السؤال الذي تريد أن توجهه للدكتور براد؟ تفضل. أستاذ ضيف الله. محسن المسرحي، إذا تعطون المجال الأستاذ محسن المسرحي. محسن الآن ما ظهر عند المايك. طيب الله ما فتح مع المايك الأستاذ محسن. الأستاذة خلود الكلثم. الأستاذة خلود الكلثم. الزملاء اللي رافعين يديهم واللي ما يبغى يشارك ينزل يده عشان ما ياخذ الوقت علينا فقط لا غير. أستاذة خلود. طيب أنا حتى لوقت وقت اللقاء مهم عندنا جدا. مطيع الغامدي، الأستاذة مطيع الغامدي. طيب حتى لا يذهب على الوقت، تفضلي أستاذة مطيع، كأنك فتحت المايك، تفضلي. عبير الشريف، تفضلي عبير. طيب دكتور براد، لعل ما وصلنا بحكم الوقت، احنا أخذنا تقريبا دقيقتين زيادة، كنا نريد أن نأخذ سؤالا. أعرف تماما أن ما يدور في الشات من الكلمات الشكر والتقدير لكم دكتور براد لن تستطيع أن تفي حقكم من الشكر والثناء لما قدمتموه في هذا اللقاء، وأيضا كذلك لما قدمتموه من فكر نير في كتابكم المميز الأولوية للمعلمين، كيف تلهم فريق العمل، وكيف تحفزهم، وكيف تتواصل معهم، وأهمية تهيئة البيئة المدرسية لتكون بيئة محفزة للمعلمين. وأنا أذكر عندما كنت معلما مدير التعليم في منطقة الليث، الأستاذ برع البركاتي كان له مقولة: بيئة جاذبة للطلاب ومحفزة للمعلمين تحقق تعليما وتعلما مميزا. وهي تتكامل مع ما ذكرتموه براد في أن بيئة التعلم هي بيئة المعلم، وأن بيئة المعلم هي نجاح بيئة التعلم. أحيلكم مرة أخرى لقراءة كتاب الدكتور براد. دكتور براد، هناك طلب من الحضور أن يكون لنا لقاء آخر معك، وسنتواصل معك في لقاء آخر حول هذا الموضوع لأهميته. قد نستضيفك في يوم المعلم العالمي أو في لقاءات قادمة للمكتب التربية العربي، ونتشرف. وقد يكون هناك لقاء حضوري أيضا كذلك، نشرف بك في قامة علمية مثل شخصكم الكريم. لا أريد أن أستأثر بالحديث، لو أنقل لك الشكر والتقدير الذي كتبه الزملاء حول ما قدمتموه فهو كثير وغيظ من فيض. أكرر مرة أخرى الشكر والتقدير لهذه الأمسية العلمية الرائعة والحضور الكريم، أكثر من 500 مستفيد من الدول الأعضاء. هذه الشخصيات حقيقة تحضر لقاءاتنا. اللقاء براد لدينا لقاء شهري نستضيف فيه خبير تربوي حول موضوع من الموضوعات. نحن بمناسبة العودة للمدارس في دول الخليج تقريبا، بدأت المملكة وبدأت سلطنة عمان وبدأت كثير من الدول، خصصنا 8 لقاءات شهرية افتتحناها بلقائكم براد، وكنا نعني فيه حقيقة البدء بلقائكم لأهميتكم كخبير ولأهمية الموضوع ولأهمية ما نتحدث عنهم وهم المعلمون. أكرر شكر معالي المدير العام الدكتور عبد الرحمن العاصمي لكم دكتور، وأكرر الشكر مرة أخرى لزملائي خلف الشاشات الذين عملوا على إعداد هذا اللقاء وعلى ترجمة لغة الإشارة وعلى النقل من خلف شاشات التقنية. تصبحون على خير، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
Thank you. Thank you.